EU SPI could be used to inform and improve policy making in relation to policies supported by the cohesion policy. During this year, we implemented a couple of different activities in the context of this project. We have, for instance, already conducted an online questionnaire in order to gather information in order to gather the views of the interested stakeholders about the EU SPI index. At the moment, we organize field visits in 10 pilot regions in order to find out whether and how the index can be used at regional level, and for sure how it should be adapted and improved on this regional level. We also launched a project website. I will copy in the link to the website as well into the chat box. We will update this EU SPI project website regularly. We will also publish continuously forthcoming EU SPI appointments, like the virtual meetings. In fact, the virtual meeting which takes place today is the first one of an event series. Additional meetings will follow, so the next one will be scheduled at the end of June, in fact, on the 27th of June. All in all, we plan to organize around 8 meetings until the end of this year. Detailed information will be provided on the website, as already said. Before I give the floor to our speaker, I just would like to ask you to consider some formal aspects of this meeting. These formal aspects and additional information about the procedure is also available in the chat box. Due to the tight program, we cannot organize an introduction round in the beginning. Nonetheless, you are warmly invited to type your name and affiliation in the chat box. If you would like to get follow-up information, you can add your email address as well, or you can also write your email to me, to the facilitator. My email address is already mentioned in the chat box. In order to make the content of this session available to some stakeholders who cannot participate, we prepare a recording of this session. If you do not want to appear in the recording, you can hide yourself by muting the microphone and switching off the video. The session will be divided in 3 parts. Our speaker, Susanna Franco, who will be introduced by me shortly, will give inputs on the following topics. She will start with an input on the selection of indicators. Then the second input has the title Constructing the Composite Index. And the third and last input has the title Interpreting the Index and Scorecard. You will have the opportunity to ask questions and to share as well your experiences after each input, as long as we stay in the time frame. We have to ensure a punctual termination at 4 p.m. If you have a question, or if you would like to share an experience and information, please announce it in the chat box. Then I will give you the floor. But please make sure that your microphone is muted unless you are speaking. Any background noise should be avoided. If you have questions on that, on these formal aspects, please let me know. Make a note on that in the chat box. Yeah, then I will give you the floor. Just give me just a couple of seconds to check the chat box. Okay, couple of greetings. Thank you. But as far as I can see, no concrete questions with respect to the formal aspects to the procedure. So this is for me the sign that I can go ahead and we can start with the first input. I'm very happy that Susana Franco from the Orchestra Basque Institute of Competitiveness is available today. Susana has studied mathematical economics at the University of the Basque Country. She also holds a PhD in economic development. Before joining Orchestra, Susana worked at various British and Latin American universities. Susana is not only involved in the currently running EU SPI pilot project, she was already involved in the creation of the first version of the EU SPI, which was launched in 2016. And her presentation has the title, How is the EU SPI constructed? What is the methodology behind it? And now I just can say, Susana, we are very much looking forward to your presentation. Please give your first input. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronique. I'm very glad to be here with you today. The idea, as Veronique has mentioned, is to share with you some of the details about how the EU SPI was constructed and the methodology. I'm not going to be very technical because I don't think that as users you need to know a lot of technicalities, but at least to give you some ideas that can help you to interpret the index and to know why some of the decisions were made at the time. So as Veronique has mentioned, I've divided the presentation in 3 parts. If you have any questions while I'm speaking, Veronique has mentioned you can raise your point in the chat, or at least say that that you have a question. I'm seeing a note saying that my connection is a bit unstable. I hope that is going to stay and remain okay. But at the end of each of the parts, I will leave some space to collect questions as well. So if you don't have any pressing question, but still there is something that that you want to ask, maybe we can wait until the end of each part. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can follow the presentation on the screen. Sí. Compartir pantalla. Just go to the first slide. So these are the 3 parts. The first one is on selection of indicators. The second one on constructing the composite index, and the third one on interpreting the index and scorecard that follows a little bit what I'm going to say in the previous 2 sections. So regarding the selection of indicators, I'm sure that you are probably all by now aware of the framework that was used to construct the index. When we decided to compute this index for the European regions, we followed the structure of the global social progress index that was being that had been launched by the social progress imperative, with the 3 dimensions and 4 components in each of the dimensions. I think it might be worth remembering that one of the characteristics of this index is that all the indicators measure outcomes of social progress. So, for instance, in the component about health and wellness, there's no indicator about how much it's being spent in the regions in the region in terms of health, or there's no indicators about how many beds in hospitals there are available in the region, or how many physicians per inhabitant, because the idea is to measure whether that really has an impact on the health of the people that live in the regions. So that was one of the restrictions that we had in terms of collecting the indicators. The second criteria that was used was that these indicators, we wanted them to be as representative of the situation in Europe as possible. And that's why also some indicators that were in the global index have not been included in this index. And I'm trying to remember, for instance, in the component about access to basic knowledge, in the global index, they included an indicator about primary enrollment in the region. And at some point we decided that that was too basic for Europe. So even basic knowledge in Europe goes beyond primary enrollment. So that's why there are some indicators that have to do that deal with lower secondary attainment of the population or upper secondary enrollment in the schools, because that's considered to be that it's the basic that you need for access to basic knowledge in Europe. The third characteristic of the indicators was that they had to be as much as possible available at NUTS2 level, because if the idea was that we were going to compute the index at regional level, we wanted most of the indicators to be available at that level. So we went through several sources. We tried to search for different indicators that might fit in those components, and we came up with a long list of 61 indicators that more or less fitted all these three criteria. By the way, you can download from the DG Regio page, from the European Commission page, the methodological document. It might be a bit dense, but all the details are there. So the long list of 61 indicators, before putting them in the index, there was an analysis, a test made at the level of each component. That was the principal component analysis, because the idea was that if you include several indicators in one component, they should be try to measure in the same thing. So if there's a distortion between the indicators, if there's a misfit among them, that was not good option for the component. So that's why this principal component analysis was carried out, and some of the indicators fell out of the list, because the idea of this index is, even if the scorecard is very useful and you can follow the progress in many different indicators, was to put together indicators that meant something being together. So that took us to that final list of 50 indicators. Let me see if I can. So the sources that we used for the indicators were varied. Mainly, most of them come from Eurostat. So I don't know if you can see clearly the colors there, but the indicators that are in black in that list come directly from Eurostat. Most of them you can download them directly at the NUTS2 level from Eurostat. Some of them come from Eurostat, but they come for a specific requests that were made to get extraction from the European Survey of Income and Living Conditions. So those are indicators that you find at national level in Eurostat, but usually you cannot find them at regional level. One of the reasons is that, and I'll come back to that in the following slide, I think, is that they are not available at regional level for all countries. In some countries, when they collect this data, the sample they use is not big enough to have the details for the indicator at regional level. It's only available at NUTS1 and a higher level of disaggregation, or even at national level in some countries. So another source that was used was Gallup. This is the company that produces surveys on different issues around the world. And with Gallup, what was done is that DG Regio bought some data from them, and they asked them to provide that data at NUTS2 level for the project. As they bought the data, and this is a private company, the data could not be made public at the time. So for this edition of the index, from the 2016 edition, the data was not, for those particular indicators, has not been made public, even if it has been included in the index, and it's included for the computation of the index. And then from some other sources that you can see there, the European Environmental Agency, the European Quality of Government Index, and even the Eurobarometer. What happens with these indicators is that even if the idea is to try to measure social progress as much as possible using hard indicators, this is not possible in all cases. This is particularly the case with the Gallup survey, because at the end of the day, with the Gallup, they are asking them about satisfaction or impressions about some issues. So something that we need to consider when we interpret the data is that to some extent, and even with the imperfections that some of the indicators that use hard data have, some of them kind of measure the reality, and some of them measure the perceptions about the reality. We could argue that maybe that's not the most satisfactory way of doing it, but that would have meant living without indicators, some of the components maybe. And also, one might argue that as important as the real progress is, the perceptions that people have about that progress are also important. So some of these indicators are measuring how people perceive some of these components. I mentioned that usually depending on the source, not all the indicators have the same geographical coverage. So even if you see the scorecards for the regions, and there are scorecards for all of the regions, not all the indicators reflect the reality of only that particular region. In the next table, you can see that depends on the country. So in countries like Italy, for instance, all the components are measured at NUTS2 level, because at least 50% of the indicators that are in that component are available for Italy at NUTS2 level. In some other countries, that's not the case, and there are several components in which this is particularly important. If we look, for instance, at the component on shelter, in some countries, for instance, in Portugal, you will see that some of the components at a regional level, but they will be the same for all the regions in Europe, because that's only available in red at country level. So when we interpret the indicators afterwards, we might need to get back to this table, or we might need to get back to the particular indicators to really understand whether that means what was possible to measure at regional level, or if it was at another level. In some other countries, like I don't know, in the Netherlands or in Poland, for instance, some of the indicators were available at NUTS1 level in yellow for some of the components. Some of the ones that have more reds are the components for shelter and personal rights in many countries. So we have to be aware of that when we interpret the index. Then also, the index was launched in 2016, and the DG Regio is already working on the next edition of the index that will be launched either at the end of this year or the beginning of 2020. But constructing the index takes some time, and getting the data for the regions takes also some time. So what happened was that for the index that you have now, that you can see the scorecards, most of the indicators come from data that was average in many cases over 3 years, because what happened with some of the indicators was that there were some missing data, some of the data was a bit erratic. So in order to try to get better measure, a more accurate measure of what was happening, in many cases what was used was an average of 3 years. And in many of the cases, of the indicators, it was the average between 2011 and 2013. In some cases, it was just a single year. The actual details of each indicator are available in a data set that can be downloaded also from the Commission's webpage. But as an indication, you can see what was the latest year for some of the indicators. So the ones that are in red, where the latest year was 2013, the ones in green was 2012, 2011, even for some of them it was 2010. So that's, I know it's a bit disappointing, but that's the latest data that was available for a comparison with other regions at the time the index was computed. It's possible that you have national data, that you have other sources in your country that might give you an indication of how that indicator might have evolved since then. But we do not know how it has evolved in other regions. So if we're looking at the indicator in relative terms, that is unfortunately what we have. And so with this, I wanted to give you kind of few glimpses of how the indicators were selected, why we ended up with that list of indicators. And if you have maybe any questions that I have not been very clear when I was explaining, or you have other doubts, maybe you can bring them forward now.
Thank you, Susanna, for your first input. As Susanna has already said, now you have the possibility to ask questions if you have some at this stage, and make a note in the chat box if you have questions. At the moment, nothing happens.
Okay,
so I think everything is still clear, and so I invite you, Susanna, to proceed with your second input.
Good. So the second bit is about, once we had the indicators, the individual indicators, how they were aggregated and what implication that has when we interpret the index. So as the indicators are measured using different measures, before we can aggregate them, we have to somehow make them comparable. And there are several procedures that can be chosen or could have been followed when the index was constructed. But the first one, or what was decided that was going to be done, was to normalize all the indicators. Also, when you normalize indicators, you can do it in different ways. In this case, the decision that was made was to normalize them between 0 and 100, and giving meaning to both the 0 and the 100. So 0 is suppose, or is indicating the worst possible scenario that could happen for each indicator, the worst that could happen. And 100 means the best, the utopian state, the best that could happen. So if any particular region has a value of 0 for one indicator, that's the worst possible outcome in terms of social progress. And if they have 100 for one indicator, they cannot do better than that in that indicator. If you aggregate for all the indicators and you get 100 for one component, that's the best. There's no further progress that could be achieved in that component, and the same for the absolute value of the index. This that seems, quite nice. So it's like you have the worst possible and the best possible states that you could have in each indicator. It's not so easy to do when you get to each of the indicators. For some of them, it was quite easy. So for some of them, there were some theoretical values that we could apply. So in most of the cases, when the indicator was measured as a percentage of something, 0 and 100 are already there. So one example is the percentage of people having internet at home. The worst possible scenario is that nobody has internet at home in the region. That will be 0, and the best possible one is 100. So 0 people having internet at home will give a dystopian value of 0, and the same with the 100, the utopian state. More is not always better. So in some indicators, they are the other way around. So for instance, the indicator with percentage of people living in a dwelling where housing costs are a financial burden, if you have 100% of people living in those kind of houses, that will be the worst case scenario. So having 100% there gives you a dystopian, or will become a 0 when you normalize the value. Having 0 people that live in houses with a burden financial cost, that will be the best possible scenario. So that will be the 100 when you normalize the indicator. So in this case, 100 becomes 0 and 0 becomes 100. But it's just inverting the values of the indicator. In some cases, there was no that theoretical value. You have some examples there. For instance, the mortality rate at the age 65. Unfortunately, we will all die at some point, but the indicator there measures how many people die in the region before they reach the age 65. So in this case, the dystopian and utopian values were chosen as the worst possible that was seen in the series. That was 0.36%. So that was the worst that was seen in all the regions in Europe, and 0.07 was the best. So that was given the value 100 when the indicator was normalized. With the quality of institutions index, it was between -3 and +3. In some cases, the buffer, what indicates is, because the idea was that if this index and the same indicator is going to be used in the future, to use the same minimum and maximum values. So we can measure progress as well according to this indicator. So it was not the actual maximum, but maybe a little bit more or a little bit less in the case of the minimum, to allow for some of the regions to go even better than they were before. And finally, for some of them, it was not very clear. So in terms of life expectancy, what was the best that we thought that could be achieved? Was it the best that has been seen in the regions so far until the year 2013? What could be the buffer there that we could put? So rather than doing that, in that case, what was decided was to give the minimum value that was observed in the regions, but for the maximum, it was the maximum that the UN projections had projected for Europe in the year 2035, I think it was. So that's what we think might be the best that we could achieve by then. With air pollution, the minimum, the dystopian value, the 0 value, is given to the regions that have 40, I don't know how, in which the unit, it was 40 micrograms or something. I can't remember the pollutant, but that's like the absolute maximum that the European Commission says that will be acceptable in regions in Europe. And the best value will be to have absolutely clean air in the region, so that will become 100. This is important, and we'll come back to this when we interpret the index, because that means that for each of the components, the the score that we get has a meaning, because it gives us the meaning of how close we are from that utopian state, the best that we could achieve in social progress, or the worst that we have achieved. So that was one of the points regarding the normalization of the indicators. But then how do we aggregate them once we have all of them between 0 and 100? So there's a difference in which the way the indicators were aggregated to get the score at the component level, and then how the different components were aggregated to get the dimension score or the index score. So when aggregating each component, just the arithmetic mean was used. So if we had for one component, we have 4 indicators, and on the table you see the values, the first values on the left, that you just do the arithmetic mean, and if those were the normalized values, that will mean that for that particular component, your best in indicator 3 and your worst on indicator 2, but you do the average and you get a 50 for that indicator. But you will get exactly the same with the column on the right. So you can compensate that you are worse on indicator 2 because you're better on indicator 1. So you compensate one indicator with the other completely. So that was why the arithmetic mean was used, and it was used because before the principal component analysis had been done, and that meant that more or less the indicators were well aligned with each other, and not the same weight could be given to all the indicators. But when looking at the aggregation across components to get the average for the dimension, what was decided was that it was not such a good idea to use the simple arithmetic means. So rather than that, kind of another alternative mean is used, the generalized mean of power 0.5. I won't explain how you compute this, but the idea is that it's when you use the arithmetic mean, you allow for compensation between the different indicators. If the complete alternative will be to use the geometric mean, and that means that you are penalized because of the lowest indicator that you get there. The generalized mean is somewhere in between, but it's penalizing the regions that have low scores in certain components or in certain indicators within the component. So the idea is that it's not enough with being very good in some of the things. In order to achieve social progress, you have to advance in all of them. So it's better to advance more on the ones that have lower levels, and you will get higher scores in the components and in the actual index, that if you advance the same amount in indicators in which you're already well positioned and you have achieved high progress. So that's why this kind of strange mean was used to aggregate between indicators and between components. It doesn't matter when you look at each indicator separately; it has no effect, but it has implications when we look at the score for the component, for the dimension, for the dimension and for the final index. Questions and comments about this part?
Thank you, Susanna. As Susanna has said, you are now invited to ask questions if you have questions. At the moment, I do not see any questions or notes with respect to that in the chat box. So I think we can again proceed with the third input, Susanna.
That's good. Maybe if you still have some questions at the end, we can come back to that. So how do we then interpret the scorecard? Because at the end, and this is also something that it will be interesting to see your views on this, on whether you find this way of presenting the results useful to interpret, because when the Commission is presenting the next edition of the index, if you have difficulties with interpretation, if you think of better ways that might be more useful for you to get access to the results, it will be good to have your views on this. So when you go into the website of the European Commission, you have the map that shows the differences in the index and the different dimensions. But I think that the main tool to interpret the results is to go to the scorecard of the particular region that you want to analyze. So I had to choose one, and being from the Basque Country, I've chosen the scorecard from the Basque Country to explain what we get there. So you get something quite similar to this. So at the end, at the top, you get the final score of the index. You also get the GDP in purchasing per capita power of the region in the year 2011, because the idea was to also have an indication of we're measuring social progress here, but how does the region looks in terms of economic progress measured by one of the more traditional indicators, that is the GDP per capita measured in purchasing power parity. So we compensate for differences in prices in the region. So the first part that we can see is that we can look at the score, both for the index, for each of the three dimensions, and for each of the components. So just looking at the scores, we get some information about the region. I've marked there in green the component in which the Basque country get the best results. So as I was saying before, the absolute value of the score gives us some information. That means that we're very close to the absolute best, that was 100 in this particular component. So in terms of water and sanitation, the score tells us that we're quite well positioned. The worst indicator, the worst component in the case of the Basque Country, is personal rights. Only 29 is the score there. So there's still lots of improvement that can be made in this particular component in terms of personal rights as measured by these indicators in the Basque Country. What we do not know, just looking at the score, is that's only if we look at ourselves and we do not compare with any other regions. So we could have got this just looking at the indicators from the Basque Country and normalizing them, aggregating them, and not comparing with any other regions. There's more information in the score. So apart from in the scorecard, apart from the indication, there's the rank there, and the rank gives us the position of the Basque Country with regard to the other 272 regions in Europe, in the EU 28. So the Basque Country's position in the 102 region in terms of social progress in Europe. It was the 35 in terms of the GDP per capita. So one of the conclusions that I get from this is that we're doing much better in economic terms than what we're doing in social terms, according to these indicators, because when we compare with others, we're far worse position there. If I look component by component, personal safety is the one in which the Basque Country is best positioned, is the third among Europe. It's not as well positioned as in terms of, sorry, the score is not as good as in water and sanitation, but the position is much better. So that means that one of the interpretations will be that in terms of water and sanitation, most of the regions, or at least 100 regions, are also very well positioned. There's a lot of social progress that has been achieved in that component, because there are many regions that are above 92. That was the score for the Basque Country. Personal safety, we are still not that bad in terms of the absolute score, 87, but we're very well in when we are compared with other regions in Europe. And again, the worst component is the personal rights component. So we are almost at the bottom of the list of the regions there. So that becomes a component that it's starting to worry me in some sense in the Basque Country, because both in absolute terms and in relative terms, compared with all other regions in Europe, we're quite badly positioned. The other information that you have in the scorecards is the comparison with the peers, with the economic peers. In the up here, in the scorecards, you have the traffic lights, kind of the different points there. But what does that mean, and how those peers were selected? So, in these graphs here, I have plotted the GDP per capita in the horizontal axis, and the social progress index in the vertical axis. So each of the dots there is one region in Europe, the bluish regions there. There seems to be a positive relationship between the GDP per capita and the social progress, so there's a positive relationship between them, and all the regions are situated there. The Basque Country is the orange dot, and the economic peers, the closest peers in terms of GDP per capita, are the black dots there. So if you look at the graph, what it means is that those are the regions that are closest to the Basque Country in the horizontal axis, either because they have a little bit less GDP per capita or a little bit more GDP per capita. The same with over Norrland in Sweden. So that's the region, and those are the economic peers, the closest in terms of GDP per capita. Why have I painted the regions in different colors? The Basque Country, if we look at, and that's the value for the social progress index, is situated more or less in the middle among the peers. So that means that it's not doing very well compared to their peers, and it's not doing badly either. So more or less in the middle, and that's why it gets the orange there. On the other hand, over Norrland, with the regions that have a similar GDP per capita, is performing much better. So that's why in the traffic lights they get the green color there. So that is kind of trying to give you a visual explanation of how the traffic lights will compare in the scorecard. That will happen with that will be with the representation for the score, but we could have done the same with each of the other dimensions, the scores of the dimensions and the components. So in this case, this is what the different colors will mean for the Basque Country. In this case, for instance, water and sanitation, that has quite a high score. It gets red when compared with the regions that have a similar GDP per capita. So we're doing well, but we're doing worse than other regions that also have the resources to invest in this component. personal rights, again, is one of the components that gets worrying because it gets the red at the level of the component and gets reds for each of the indicators there. So with all this information, when I was looking at the scorecard for the GDP, sorry, for the Basque Country, I've already got a lot of information that comes from the different ways in which it is presented. When you go to the scorecard in the website, that's kind of the image that that you get. But you still have more information that you could add to that scorecard if you download the file with the data, because here you don't have information about the individual indicators. You could get that from the scorecard. It's not readily given to you, but it's in the data file. So with that, you could have information about the value of each of the indicators and also the rank for each of those indicators as compared to the other regions in Europe. But that it's more work in the sense that that you have to do to get this kind of detail. But with all that, I can go back and look at what are the components that I think that the Basque Country should be kind of paying more attention to. In this case, I know that in Spain, all the components are representative at NUTS 2 level. So something that I do not need to check is whether this is kind of representative of the Basque Country or if it's representative of the whole of Spain somehow, because I've already checked that. For some of the countries, maybe one of the first check-ins that will be important to do is to really see for those components whether it's something that it's showing what's happening in other regions in the country as well. So some of those components to kind of summarize some of that information. For instance, in terms of water and sanitation, the score is quite good, the rank is average, and there's a poor performance when compared to economic peers. What are the worst indicators within this component? One of them is the satisfaction with water quality. So one question that I might ask myself is whether this is representing the reality or is the perception of some of the people regarding this. Also, one of the components is the one that is positioned in 134 in the compared with two other regions, is the sewage treatment. This was an indicator that if I check the data is from 2010, so maybe the reality has changed since that. So the data might be too old and it's not quite of reflecting the reality, because at least my perception from living here is that the reality is not as bad as that. Here they are saying that 74% of the houses have sewage treatment and almost 1 in 4 doesn't have it. That's not the impression that I have. So in some cases, maybe it's worth checking the data that's behind that. Another component is the shelter component, is the one in which it has the worst score in all the dimension of basic human needs. The rank is not very good either, and there's a poor performance when I compare it with other with the economic peers. But in terms of thinking of what can be done about this component, what kind of policies might address the burdensome cost, for instance? So, because that's the one that is worst position. If the housing is taking a lot of the income, what can be done? What kind of policy could be addressed to that? Or the fact that there's a lack of adequate heating, so maybe there's some kind of subsidy that could be addressed to that particular indicator, if that's something that is really it's really worrying. So, and maybe doing something about those other indicators might help to achieve better satisfaction related and get a better indicator there in terms of satisfaction, which is a soft indicator. In the foundations of well-being, and the component of access to information and communication, for me, it was also a bit worrying because there's no too good score, and the ranking was not very good either, and they were also underperforming in this particular component. But to me, it's not clear what's the cause of that. In all those indicators, we have the outcomes, but we do not know the causes of these particular outcomes. In that case, maybe the lack of infrastructure. When I check the infrastructure for ICT, for instance, in the Basque Country, is quite high. I have other data to look at this. So there might be something that it's causing those bad results. Maybe the infrastructure is there, but the cost is too high. Or maybe people are using other facilities to access the internet from their work, or maybe something to do with habits. There might be also older population and many houses with older population that are not using the internet as compared to other regions. So it's a question of trying to understand what's behind the data before we can suggest any policies in terms of that. Then in terms of in terms of the environmental quality, the rank is quite good, but the score is really bad. It's only 56, so we're very far from reaching the best outcome that we could have in terms of environmental quality. But the fact that the rank is quite high, to me it suggests that this is a challenge for many regions, not only for the Basque Country. So maybe some of the solutions should come from doing and cooperating and collaborating with other regions to improve this component. And finally, personal rights. Finally, maybe I should have started with this one because it's the one in which everything seems to be bad in the Basque Country. So the score is bad, the rank is bad, we have reds in everything. So it's the worst on everything. The point is that this component, and you might see if you look at the indicators when you advance from basic human needs to foundations of well-being to opportunity, you get more and more indicators that are soft indicators, and they have to do with perceptions because it's very difficult to measure some of those components with hard data. So most of those indicators are reflecting perceptions, and when I look at the results for other Spanish regions, we all get very bad results. So there seems to be something national there. Also because of the way the questions were asked. The question is whether you trust the political system, not particularly the political system of the region. It might be the political system of Spain, and the time of when the questions were asked, still, I mean, the situation, particularly here, was a bit delicate in political terms. So there might be, it's true that there's no trust in the institutions, but whether that applies to the regional institutions or the national institutions, and how we could overcome that lack of trust, well, that's something that we will need to think hard to see how this could be addressed. But this is kind of, with this, what I wanted to give you is kind of how, knowing how the indicators were collected and what's behind them, the kind of interpretation that I could make about the scorecard of my own region, maybe give you some ideas of how you could interpret the results for your regions. But I will be happy to listen to your comments on that. If you have any questions or any suggestions of how you have used the indicators, any doubts that you could have, or how to improve them in the future.
Thanks a lot, Susanna, for your inputs. We have now more than half an hour time remaining for questions and for a discussion as well. And I can see that Livio from Bucharest has already raised a question. I will read it. It is in the chat box. How can we approach the subject in countries or in regions where there is no interest of local authorities for the EU SPI? Some indicators concern the authorities, but not the index as a whole. Livio, would you like to add something or further explain this question? Now there is the opportunity to do that if you would like that verbally. In this case, you just need to unmute your microphone. But I think there's no need to add something, so this is it. Yeah. Susanna, would you like to answer?
I think it's always difficult to get the relevant authorities involved in this, because they can, for some of these indicators and components, they might not have the power to change things on those particular components. They might not see the relevance for them, and it might be higher authorities that should be addressing some of these indicators. But I think at least it will be good if they could see how they compare to other regions or to other cities, because there are many capital cities among the regions. So it's interesting to compare with them as well and see if the local authorities can get some knowledge that might help them to see in relative terms. In some cases, we might be pointing out to some issues that are obvious already for them, so that maybe they don't see the interest because of that, because they say, I already knew that there was a problem with that. I didn't need this index to tell me about it.
Thank you, Susanna. Livio has also added, there are no studies, articles, news regarding the EU SPI in Romanian language. This is an issue as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably, I mean, it might be a problem for some of the languages as well. What has been produced in English, I think, the common language. So for some of us, it's we have the task of kind of translating it to our local stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there any other questions, or you are for sure also invited to share your experiences you have made, probably on regional level, with the EU SPI index? It would be for sure interesting for us as project partners for the whole consortium to learn more about potential experiences which have been made with the indicator.
Okay. For instance, do you find the way that it's the information is presented in the scorecard useful to interpret it, or were you missing something that you would like to see there?
So this is also a question to the whole community, to the participants. If you don't have any questions, or there is also at this point, at least I can see no signs in the chat box that anybody would like to add something with respect to additional experiences. There's probably the question what else we should focus during our next virtual meetings. I just would like to mention at this stage that the next meeting will take place at the end of this month, on the 27th of June, again between 2:30 and 4 p.m. And this meeting will focus on the results of the online survey, which we have conducted earlier this year. Yeah, and you are for sure invited to make your proposals, as I suppose you're some kind of insiders. Make your proposals what we should also bring up during the next virtual meetings, on which topics we should focus on. But there is no need to do that immediately. You can also send us an email with respect to that, for sure. And I just have seen that now some more questions, or at least comments, are visible in the chat box. Mark said, from the FCE, we have developed a document about the interpretation of the EU SPI for Catalonia. We could share it with the rest of the pilot regions if you want to. Well, I think I can already say that it would be great if you can share this with us, for sure, and we organize the distribution among the pilot regions. Or Mark, would you like to add something with respect to that, or would you like to share it immediately right now with the participants? So,
hi there. This is Mark speaking. Does it work well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you. Perfect.
So the thing is that, yeah, when the index was published, we were very interested, and we spoke with Susana too. And he presented the index here in Barcelona. We started analyzing the data for Catalonia and for all regions, and we produced a document for our regional government. And we have now just finished translating it to English, because it was in Catalan. So we are able to share it with you if you find it interesting. And there we have plotted the data in different ways that may be useful to better understand the the results of the EU SPI. And that's it. If you find that it's useful, we can share it among the pilot regions, the consortium, and other stakeholders that are interested.
Thank you for this opportunity, and this would for sure be good if this is possible, for sure.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Yes.
If I can say something as well, because I think that's following the previous comment about not having sometimes the information is not out there in the local languages. Having these kind of documents, as Mark was saying, that can give detailed information about the region for each of us. Maybe we find through them interesting ways in which we can bring the message to the local stakeholders in our own language. So having an example from Catalonia might be very inspiring to get the data presented in different ways and getting good messages that can be then translated and used in the different regions. So that will be definitely very useful.
Okay, thank you. There is an additional question.
This is me, Veronica. Hi, it's from me.
For sure. Okay. Tonya,
hi.
Would like to add something? Yes, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Susanna, for the presentation. And thank you all for participating. I think the presentation is very interesting in terms of understanding how the different components of the index have been constructed. especially the example that you gave from the Basque Country is very illustrative of how we can interpret some of the elements of the index, but also to try and understand what is behind them, because like you said, we are discussing outputs here and not inputs, what led us here, but the actual result. So I was thinking that because we had some discussions before with the regions during the launch event, but also in individual discussions when we were trying to identify the topics for the different case studies. If the colleagues from the different regions can give us an idea, an overview of their own understanding of how the index is being interpreted. Do you have a good idea of how you can interpret the charts, the different charts that are being developed for each of the regions? Do you understand the various components? Because to me it is a bit strange that there are no questions at all. And I think that from my perspective, what I saw, especially for the Basque region, with regards to the lack of trust to the political institutions, that would be something that is very relative to my own country and to the regions here in Greece. I can relate to that because there is a lot of skepticism in terms of how transparent the political system is and how things are working in terms of policy making. So I was wondering whether there are any other relevant aspects that you consider to be similar in your countries, and whether you can see actually the index interpreting them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tonya. I'm just waiting for some reactions. But until now, nobody types in something in the chat box. So I propose to stop here. If you agree, this is also the question to our speaker, Susanna and Tonya, who has just spoken, who is representing the lead partner of this project. At the moment, no further questions or arise, and no further topics are on the screen visible. So I, as already said, propose to stop it here. If you agree.
If by any chance there are any follow-up questions that you don't want to formulate here, you can send us an email and we will try to follow up. But I think that you need to see this kind of events as an opportunity to raise your voice and give us an insight of what is happening in your regions, because this is what we're trying to do here. Unless these things are interactive, we are feeling like we are not really giving you something. And I believe that the presentation was, in fact, very interesting, and it could raise several questions. And I'm just wondering why there aren't any. But in any case, if by any chance you have any questions and you want to formulate them at a later stage and send them by email to any of us, we will be happy to get back to you and maybe follow up with a different session to discuss in a more interactive way. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that this first session was also because we weren't sure. I think that some of you are very familiar with the index, some of you might be less familiar, so it was kind of bringing some of the details about the methodology. But in future sessions, we can prepare some questions for you in advance, so you can maybe bring some of encourage you to bring some of the experiences from your regions. So that will be good, and when we see each other in person, even better.
Okay, Susanna. the only thing what I would like to add at this stage, as I already have said in the beginning, please provide your email addresses if you would like to get follow-up information. In fact, also the recording of this meeting, which might be probably quite interesting for you and other colleagues. And yeah, for sure, we will keep you up to date with respect to the upcoming meetings as well. And for now, I just say thank you for staying with us, for listening to the presentation. And let's keep in touch. Thanks a lot, and have a nice afternoon. Bye.